So this panel is on how to spend it if we had it. And I wanted to make 2 points by way of introduction. The first is the if, which is the pot of gold, or was it a pot of gold? A bag of gold. I would like to suggest that we all pretend throughout the day how big that bag of gold is, how much is in it. I did a very simple ask number of people, and I got numbers from 6 billion to 40 billion, more or less. The 6 billion is implied additional over current spending on ODA. On the 40 billion, it's a little bit less clear whether it's all additional or it's international climate finance, but perhaps coming as what was counted as ODA.
Per year by 2020.
Per year, sorry, by 2020. And for those of you who are aware, many of you are, of the $100 billion promise made at Copenhagen, this is public money. So my crude survey was how much public money will be available. 6 billion to, no, actually I wrote down 30 billion, not 40 billion. 6 billion to 30 billion. And we might remind ourselves throughout the day there's some distinction between mitigation and adaptation, but perhaps we'll hold on what the division of, say, even the 30 billion could be. That's the first point. Second point is the how to spend it if we had it. I think most of you are probably thinking of how in terms of the allocation of the 30 billion or the 6 billion between basic research on clean energy, for example, between reducing deforestation, between spending on infrastructure, perhaps with public money leveraging the other 60 or 70 billion in private money of the 100 billion. But there's another how that we want you to keep in mind, and I say this in particular as a development person, and the other how is who's in charge of the money? Is it the funders or the fundees? And what is the delivery mechanism? There are a lot of lessons from the delivery mechanisms in the ODA system, in the aid system. And many people would say the aid system is extraordinarily creaky and inefficient at best, intrusive, and ineffective at worst. What are these lessons, if they exist, for any transfers of international climate finance? And finally, a third point, what is international climate finance? Is it only money that's transferred, or is it money that's spent inside rich countries on the global public good associated with any reductions in climate change? So with that introduction, I hope the panelists in particular will keep those numbers and ideas in mind. I'm very pleased to introduce our 3 panelists, starting with Artur de la Serra de Cardoso. Yeah, well, a good name. Artur is from the Ministry of Finance. He's a Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for the IMF, the World Bank, climate finance. He explained to me yesterday that he has 1 staff member for every 6 or 7 in the Treasury Department of the U.S. responsible for that set of activities. So he was just in China recently for a month, learning about and looking at the cap and trade session there. Let's start with I think I should probably be sitting down, and you're going to, as you like, stand here or from your seat.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to be very brief with my presentation because I only have 7 minutes. So, well, I know a little bit of some of you, and I think what is very important to understand, if you want to understand how developing countries want to spend the money, if we have it, we need to understand their strategies. So especially the climate change strategies, but not only. Just to give an example, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brazilian context in order to show what we did, what we are doing, how we want to spend climate finance. So basically, Brazil established its climate change planning in 2008. We have voluntary emission reductions, but internally they are legally binding. We have a law that sets these targets for different sectors of the economy. And as you know, the main strategies related to combating deforestation and forest degradation, and also acting on the drivers for deforestation. So moving right away to results, this is basically what we have in terms of reduction of deforestation in Brazil, in terms of million tons of CO2 equivalent. So since 2003, what we have seen is a sharp reduction in emissions, and we were able to decouple the emissions from the agriculture production. So you have there the numbers for the soybean productions and the cattle ranching productions. So these actually the results that we have seen based on the strategies we have put in place. So to understand specifically how are our emissions, the total emissions, not only from deforestation, we have actually managed to reduce the total emissions, and since 2004 till 2011, I don't have the number here, but we have been, as you can see, the green part is the emissions from land use change, and we have been able to really change the profile of the emissions in the country in the last 10 years or a little bit less. Sectors like energy and agriculture, they remain important and became actually more important to tackle now on. So to be very simple, in very simple terms, we have been able to really reduce emissions more than all Annex 1 countries together. So this is basically comparing to 2005, 2003, 1995 inventory. When you put all together all Annex 1 parties and the numbers of Brazil, you can see that really we have an undeniable success story. So what we did, I'm going to talk briefly about our combating deforestation, but we have set different plans involving 14 ministries, 200 initiatives, and we put in place many policies and programs in order to have this. This involved engagement with civil society, this involved command and control actions, it involved strong monitoring systems, financial regulations, and it's involved actually external support. We have very important partners, Norway and Germany, and also other countries that create finance incentives and help us develop capacity building. So let's focus now on the topic of discussion. So I put here some questions to drive the what I want to say. So should allocation focus on mitigation potential or needs? We have a clear position that, especially for adaptation, the focus is on needs. So we are talking about criteria as vulnerability and income to drive the allocation. So it's really about supporting poor countries to adapt to climate change. But in terms of mitigation, it's a combination of needs and mitigation potential and efficiency. So we are talking here about governance, we are talking here about capacity. So especially when you think about mitigation potential, we look, for instance, at natural resources and forests. You see that forests are not spread all over the world evenly. So if you want to do something related to natural resources, you will have to really consider where these forests are, and sometimes they are going to be in middle-income countries, not only low-income countries. So should we support countries' priorities or donor priorities? So our view is that climate change agenda will only be viable if you link climate change to the development agenda of countries, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. It's not a separate thing. But what we want is really flexibility to use resources to what is in our own development agenda, so earmarking resources towards, let's say, wind energy or solar energy will not really be effective, because what we want is really, what we need is actually a puzzle of technologies and initiatives. We need diversity in terms of tackling climate change. We need to connect these finance instruments and the climate finance to countries' strategies and programs. If you want to leverage, you have to combine the domestic resources to external resources. So should we go private or public sector? Which should we support? Our experience showed that we have to use the public sector to crowd in the private sector. We need really clear policy direction from the public sector in order to address market failures, to get prices right, to create incentives for the private sector to comply with the legislation, the environmental requirements. Well, we want to leverage resources, so our experience showed that we need to support overarching policies. So instead of working in a project-by-project approach, we need to actually use this external financing to support programs that are nationwide, or that will be able to really provoke transformational change in the country. We need to strengthen the public sector capacity to implement its policies and programs. We need to use more results-based payments, and the Amazon Fund is an example of how you do that. We need to facilitate access to finance, so here the climate finance can help change the interest rates and maturities of financial vehicles that we have put in place in the country, so you leverage resources. We need to support business-friendly reforms in order to help the private sector to do its part. We need to put in place economic instruments and public-private partnerships. So, just to finalize, this is my last slide. What we need is more money or better money. Our view is that we need better money. We need predictability. Clear envelopes or periodic allocation process help a lot to long-term planning. We need to use multiple vehicles and instruments, and developing countries are able to decide what are the comparative advantages of each one. We need a more direct and simplified access to resources. We don't need additional administrative filters and bureaucratic layers. We need to use country systems and performance-based payments, and we need to focus the M&E on supporting the implementation, the improvement of the policies, and that should be the basis for accountability. My conclusion is, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mice. So donors, the idea is really to see what countries want in terms of their development strategies and see how to connect to that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Artur. Now, the idea is to get a perspective from, or get different perspectives. So next we have Billy Pizer, who is an associate professor at Duke University in economics and energy and environment. He's basically one of our country's finest environmental economists. Billy spent time in a job, in one of the jobs of Artur. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of the Treasury for Energy and Environment, and I believe he was the representative, the working representative for the U.S. on the expert panel on climate finance. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking not about how to get it, but how to spend it. Billy, thank you for joining us, and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development.
Yeah, and I just wanted to start by thanking Nancy and Larry and Michelle for inviting me to come and for inviting me to be a non-resident fellow, among other things. It's been great to have this relationship with CGD. I also just wanted to say I think it's, it may seem like a somewhat fantastical discussion, but as I think about it, all these issues of how you spend the money, how you raise the money, what you get for the money, these are all inextricably linked. And so I think it's a very important discussion to be having. There are three points I just wanted to make briefly during these introductory remarks, which I guess I will have 6 minutes now. I probably just used a minute. The first one is backing up a bit, and I hope I'm not getting too far off topic here. I think it's important to realize, at least the way I think about it, that the direct outcomes of climate finance, in some sense, are not the most important feature of public climate finance. And what I mean by that is, over the past 10 years, past 20 years, I feel like what has happened is climate finance has been part of the puzzle that has helped to unlock progress on mitigation actions. And I think keeping that in mind, helps us think about how we ought to spend it. Partly because if we realize that, on the one hand, there's leveraging opportunities to get money for climate finance, when progress on these other issues is needed, and that's, for example, the $100 billion in Copenhagen came in an effort to unlock the negotiations, and so that tends to be when you see these sorts of things happen. But the most important progress you're going to make on solving the problem is not going to be publicly financed. It's going to be through the decisions that countries make domestically, and trying to figure out ways to encourage them to do that. I guess, and the last thing I just want to say on that point is, if we were thinking about it, somewhat abstractly, you would have to ask the question, why is climate finance actually different from ordinary development assistance? The one element that people will point to is that there's a global benefit. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But again, the global benefits are not going to be covered by public finance. So we have to think about not just what we can support with climate finance, but also how we can use climate finance to leverage more domestic actions. The second point I wanted to say, so I don't want to get completely away from what I was asked to talk about. So the best way to design it, given we're going to have climate finance, it's been part of the negotiation. We could talk about why if people want to. I think from a donor's perspective, there are, to some extent, what Artur said is completely right. I mean, intellectually, if I look at that stuff that he suggested in terms of a recipient country's interests, I don't think they're that different than the donor countries in some intellectual level. But the practical reality is the kinds of things that we can get money for through our political system is different. It's not necessarily intellectually what we think is the smartest answer. Right now, for example, I would argue, just based on my own interactions with people in Congress, for example, that getting money for the very poorest countries, getting money for adaptation, getting money for forests, tends to be the things that resonate the most with the people who are making decisions. What is interesting is that if you go back 5 or 10 years to the previous administration, their emphasis was clean energy. Again, we could talk about why that was. So one of the things I think that's important in thinking about how we prioritize is flexibility, that we think about how we can design a system of delivery and of mechanisms that are adaptable to changing donor preferences, changing individuals. And I think if you want to maximize how much resources you're getting through the system, you have to be sensitive to the fact that priorities are changing. And one thing to think about is, as Artur was saying all those things that I think are very good guidelines, it's not like we're ever going to have enough money to fund all the things we need to fund. So having flexibility, having windows where donors can shift resources as their priorities and their ability to generate money changes is not necessarily going to be wasting money if it's being spent well. It'll just maybe redirecting money to different places. Two last comments about this. One is, I think ultimately the goal, at least in the United States, has been to create space in the budget for climate finance, foreign assistance more generally, in an environment where it's very difficult. So, again, thinking about ways that we can appeal to what is marketable in a sense, whether it's the topic of the money, whether it's forests or adaptation for the poorest countries, or whether it is making progress on the negotiations, and this is an important piece of it, and this is how we do it. Whatever it is, I think creating the space in the budget is key. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the countervailing forces to this idea of having flexibility and maybe having multiple vehicles and windows where money could be reallocated based on preferences has been concern about a proliferation of funds. Certainly it was something that came up quite a bit while I was at Treasury. But I think that has to be something that we think about how to rationalize that system. I think proliferation of obligations would be a problem, but I think having some competition among funds wouldn't necessarily, or windows wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. The last thing I'll say, or my last of the 3 points, and maybe the most relevant for today in my last minute, is delivery models. And I guess 2 things catch my attention in that discussion. One is the idea of performance-driven mechanisms, whether it's the kind of quantitative mechanisms that I've written a little bit about, or whether it's more generally the idea of paying for achieving certain milestones over time. That sort of mechanism tends to be very sellable, I think, to donors, and I don't think it's necessarily at odds with a lot of the prioritizations you might do. You would just say the disbursement is based on achieving the milestones that the countries negotiate. The other thing I'll just throw out as an idea, since I'm out of time, is it'd be interesting to talk about whether the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation model, might have important lessons for how we design climate finance. I think of the 3 things that are kind of hallmarks there as being, 1, a set of indicators that basically tell you the country is in a state where it can actually has the capacity to use the money. 2 is very rigorous evaluation of the methods so you know what works. And 3 is there actually is kind of direct access. The money goes directly to the governments to disperse. Anyway, there were a couple other things I was going to say, but I'll save them for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Billy. That was great. Not so different from what Artur said, but an interesting perspective from particularly the U.S. So next we have Barry Karen, who is part of the inspiration for me behind this kind of discussion. Barry is a senior fellow at the CG, which Lawrence mentioned. He's a longtime thinker about the big issues, from the G8 to the way to organize post financial crisis, to how to organize and think about what to do at the global level. So we're very pleased to have Barry here. I'm sure he's going to say something that might be different, a little bit different from what the earlier speakers had said. Barry.
Well, thanks very much, Nancy. Thanks for having me. Artur, in a situation like this, when you come to CGD and they give you very little time, I'm reminded of something Pedro Millan, your former finance minister, used to say, which is basically, he asked his wife, how's he going to tell everybody everything he has to say in just 5 or 7 minutes? And his wife said, speak very slowly. I think I'm here to say something not really counterintuitive to you. I think you all know this, but to wake people up with a little bit of a cold shower. I want to argue that if we raise the money, we should spend it in in developed countries. We should spend it in industrialized, developed countries. And that's the best way to help the poorer developing countries, is to raise money and spend it in developed countries. And my argument basically is 4 points I want to give you. First, the criteria for spending, everybody agrees that we want incrementality, we want efficiency, but those are, while necessary, they're not sufficient criteria. There's a third criterion that's critical, and that's the feasibility of gaining legislative approval. And my argument that I'm going to make is that we're not going to get legislative approval, certainly in the United States, at the scale necessary to provide transfers to developing countries on the basis that they ask for, which, recall, is basically country-owned programs. That means they're going to govern the expenditures. It's supposed to be predictable, sustainable, and it's supposed to be new and additional. It's supposed to be grants, not loans, not export credits. This is just not going to happen. So my second point is to ensure that there's Lawrence's bag of gold is available. You want to develop a plan to spend it in the rich, developed countries. And to make sure that that money actually is available, you have to devise projects that will have the support of very influential lobby groups who are going to operate basically on the grounds of self-interest. When we talk about $100 billion, there's never been any discussion about what the appropriate breakdown between countries is supposed to be. So what you ought to do is just take a look at the calculation of the one burden sharing agreement that's got most history behind it. It's the UN assessment scale. There, the US fought hard to get their share down to 22%. If you have to fund $100 billion or $50 billion or $30 billion, the US share is going to be funded only by from a group that includes just the Annex 1 countries. So the US share has to be normalized because the Annex 2 countries aren't contributing as they do in the UN. So it's going to be about 30%. And I'm just arguing that, you know, if you look back at the history of Byrd Hagel and just all the recent congressional discussions, it's just not in the feasible set. So then a couple of ideas about what can be done. Because remember, the atmosphere is indifferent. The atmosphere is indifferent to where the reductions come from, the emission reductions come from. So developing countries will benefit just as much as anybody from emission reductions that occur because money is spent effectively in rich countries. So what should be done? Money should be spent on R&D. Money should be spent to ensure the development of really rigorous standards, to support border tax adjustments, to provide incentives for other countries to follow those standards. Money should be spent on smart infrastructure, green infrastructure. And then my two hobby horses are you want to really increase the rate of female secondary education completion, because that will lower fertility rates in the longer term, and we're all better off if the denominator of our emissions allowance per capita is shared by a smaller population. So female education is a policy. And the final thing I would say is we should spend money on public health campaigns, because there's evidence around that, well, the first people who caught on to this, I think, was Air Samoa, which charges airfares based on the weight of the passenger. So the point is, as an article in the Journal of Epidemiology found, obese people are responsible for emissions 17% more or 19% more than slender people. So for reasons aside from climate change, just public health, diabetes, disease, we should be spending money on public health campaigns. So I think I'm going to stop there before the sign is flashed at me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Barry. Let me start by, I just want to ask each of you something. In particular, Artur, I think it would be useful if you reconciled something you said that I understand is a little bit of a contradiction. You said you like pay for performance in the context of the Amazon Fund, where the Norwegians are in effect paying Brazil for its reductions in deforestation. But you also said you don't like project by project. However, it is in Brazil that the Amazon Fund, in a way, is set up as a project by project fund inside Brazil. Maybe you could just say something about the logic behind that.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. If you focus on a project by project, you mainly will start micromanaging initiatives, and we know how far the expectation from contributing countries can go in terms of controlling where you are investing the resources, what kind of procurement you are using. And I really believe that results payment instruments can be more effective. The Amazon Fund, the way it's structured, the resources come through based on results, so the Norwegian transfer the resources based on the emission reductions from deforestation. And we are in the middle of a process of reforming the fund in order to leverage even more the resources. In the end, you will need projects, you will need projects to do the transformation, the changes that you need. But the way you restructure the disbursement and you try to connect the climate finance resources to vehicles that will reach a bigger number of projects, it's more effective than looking at each specific operation and looking at them in order to have access to external financing. So what I meant is actually you should create vehicles that are much bigger, that will try to connect this to strategies, to programs, and of course to a bigger number of projects instead of submitting, looking at each specific project in an isolated way.
Right. Okay. No, I understand. We'll come back to this maybe later in a bilateral conversation, because the question is why inside Brazil, BNDES, which manages the Amazon Fund, doesn't also pay for performance. But we come back to that. I know from other things you've said why, in part, that might be the case. So, Billy, I think you and Barry were the realpolitik types in a way. Let's be realistic about defining things, that ways to spend money that will have appeal in the countries that are supposed to be, that we hope will generate the money from their own tax revenues. One of the things that you said, Billy, is this pay for performance is appealing to legislatures. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because we're very keen on it at the Center for Global Development. But we found it actually quite difficult to get the bureaucracies. So you were referring to the legislators, perhaps, but how does one cope with the bureaucracies? And how is that thought of inside the Treasury, for example?
Well, I mean, I guess my reaction would be that, when you try to sell something, it's compelling if you can tell them exactly what you're getting for the money. So that was a sense in which I felt like it was a easier thing sometimes to sell than a lot of money at the front end, where it may be very hard to tie it to
when it's about country systems and capacity building. When Bush said we're going to save lives by putting money into HIV, that was easier.
Yeah, I think
for people to understand.
The downside, I think, is that sometimes it's very hard to measure outcomes. I mean, CO2 is obviously kind of a nice metric. There's a baseline issue, kind of this soft underbelly. But I think being able to articulate the outcomes and to articulate that the money is only being dispersed as progress is being made, like I said, tends to be positive. I think that it does raise issues in bureaucratic circles sometimes. It also tends to be can be very favorable for private sector enterprises. Mm-hmm. So I think there are ways to package it, certainly in certain circumstances, that can be more appealing. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's a panacea. I just think that where you can do it, it probably is. And
do you want to say anything in reaction to Barry's point? Do you agree? Would it be easier?
I did. Certainly, it's easier to raise money to spend it domestically. That goes without saying. I think what I would do is, what I would kind of push a little bit on is backing up to why we are spending the money in the first place. If we're trying to reduce emissions, there are very particular things that public finance we know is good for. R&D, for example, such things like that. For general mitigation, we should be regulating. I mean, we should be creating incentives for the private sector to take initiatives. We cannot subsidize our way domestically any more than we can subsidize our way internationally. So I would kind of put a slight cautionary note on if we're kind of shifting to domestic because we don't think we can raise the international. I don't necessarily think that's the right argument. I think I would say internationally, at least we get some leverage in the negotiations, which tends to be helpful. And I think that's kind of the big deliverable in a sense. Mm-hmm. And then given we have to do it, we should figure out how to spend it well. So I think this has a lot of meaning. And then also the reason that I think it's important to still try to appeal to donors is we make these commitments. We'd like to be able to deliver on them. And I think that's an important piece of it.
So Barry, your idea is based on the assumption that at the legislative level, at least in the U.S., there isn't much trust that developing countries can get anything done. Or is it based on the idea that it's just better to spend the money at home?
I think it's both with equal emphasis. The other thing you've got to bear in mind is not just the U.S. Congress that's difficult. Pick a number, 30, 40, 50 billion a year, whatever it is, and apportion it across the world to the other donors. Even if the U.S. does manage somehow to come up with 30%, countries like Spain and Greece and Italy are amongst a list of potential donors. And I just don't think it's going to happen because the scale that we're talking about is equivalent to increases in their ODA that they're spending now, increases in their ODA of 70, 80, 100%. That's what we're talking about when that number 100 billion came up with. And I just don't think we're ever going to be able to satisfy the recipients. I like the quote from Jairam Ramesh, the Indian minister, a couple of years ago. He said, the fast start finance is not fast, it hasn't started, and it's not finance, because we're counting leverage as it. So in terms of our greasing the wheels in international negotiations and increasing our credibility, I don't think we can ever satisfy. The feasible set doesn't promise any outcomes that will satisfy the developing countries.
Okay, well, I'm sure there are people who disagree with you in the room who know about certain ways it has worked out. One more thing to Artur. Most countries are not as capable or have not shown the same ability and, say, commitment as Brazil. You were using Brazil as an example, but isn't it an outlier? How would we think about it in the rich world when you think of the Congo, forests in the Congo? Can you imagine paying for performance in the Congo?
To be very honest, to Brazil be in the position that we are now in terms of governance and capacity, we have received a lot of external support. Just one example, Germany has been supporting Brazil in terms of improving its management capacity in the forest sector for more than 30 years. So although we have a lot of responsibility for the results we have to acknowledge that this support has been really instrumental to put us in this position nowadays. And I think we wouldn't have the monitoring systems, we wouldn't have several of the instruments that we have to combat deforestation without this support. So I think when I look at Congo, what I think is probably how Brazil was 40 years ago or something like that in terms of forest management, or maybe less than that. But climate finance could actually support and raise this capacity and actually to do something more expedited than we did, because it would be able to build on our own experience.
So the donors would have to be patient in the Congo. It's been decades of development of that capability. Let's go to all of you, see what you want to ask any of them. Lisa, thought you'd give us something good to start with. Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, thank you. I'm loud. It's all right. Well, thank you, Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Thanks for doing this. It's very interesting. And Barry, you were very provocative, but I think I have a kind of broader question, which is, can some of you talk about or sort of put this in the context of the Green Climate Fund meeting, which is happening now in Paris. And, you know, I mean, this as an academic exercise is interesting, but what are some of the kind of top things that you think need to be decided this year while the money is still an if? And secondly, if you don't mind, Billy, I was struck by what you said that there seems to be an increasing appetite for money for the poorest in Congress right now, and I'd love to learn more about that because I haven't seen it. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places.
Okay, maybe any of you want to say a word about the Green Climate Fund? I think each of you has a perspective on that from, if not your current, your past.
Well, my impression is that they've gotten nowhere on anything other than an argument on what the decision-making structure is going to be, what the voting structure is going to be. And I think if they come up with a structure that puts the recipients in charge, that's going to basically frustrate the money raising. But I think they're nowhere.
Billy?
Sure. I would agree with that. I think, you know, there are things that, you know, I said before about having flexibility to put it in different places within the Green Climate Fund. I think having windows that may appeal more or less to different donors could be constructive. I think the point about governance is completely on. You know, ultimately for the United States, it's often more important to be able to avoid activities that are you know, contravene laws that we have, like, you know, money to Iran or something, than to necessarily promote things. So thinking about governance structures that allow us to meet those mandates is always a good idea. Your specific query about money for the poorest, I don't think we're reading anything different right now. It was more of a relative statement that getting money to go to the wealthier developing countries, the middle income countries, I think is harder. So,
it's a problem insofar as, is Indonesia viewed as wealthy or not wealthy?
I don't think it's viewed.
It's in the middle.
It's not the poorest, and so I think this is a personal view. I mean, obviously Scott and other people who tried to go to Congress and raise money would have other views. I always felt like that the poverty thing was a good card, a good argument to make. You know, exactly how far up the chain one has to go before countries are kind of viewed as, why are we giving the money? You know, that's a fair question. I don't know where exactly I would draw the line. And just to reiterate the point I made before, I think, you know, clean energy and kind of supporting industry in other countries has become much harder versus helping the poorest deal with the consequences, or helping, you know, looking for biodiversity benefits as well as climate mitigation. That seems to be easier, but it may just have to do with the particulars of the individuals who are focused on this issue right now, you know, versus who it was 10 years ago and who it might be 5 years from now.
Right, and the situation could change. We're talking about mitigation, but if there was a catastrophe in Bangladesh and millions of people died, then there might be some impetus to do adaptation funding. Artur, Green Climate Fund, what's Brazil's position? And what has been Brazil's position? Has it fought to have sufficient votes on the side of developing countries that we're getting what people are concerned about, that then there isn't any confidence on the part of the traditional donors, and so there won't be the money on the table?
Well, what we expect in terms of the GCF, it's a flexibility, but a little bit different than what Billy has said. I see that there is an interesting model that you use the GCF to package the climate finance and to put things together in order to have some consistency and some predictability. But what I mean in terms of multiple instruments and vehicles is that developing countries, they will have the capacity to choose what institutions are the best ones to put in place and to help implement their strategy. So I think it's not so much on the donors choosing to change all the time or their preference in terms of vehicles, but much more on countries to see which institution can better help countries to put in place their strategies.
I'm not sure I completely understood, but what you're saying is that from the point of view of Brazil, it would be good to have multiple funds, including the Green Climate Fund, and so you don't put all your eggs in that basket. You would not like to see all the donor eggs in that basket.
No, what I mean is mainly that inside the Green Climate Fund, it would be useful to have different instruments and institutions to put in place and to implement projects and initiatives. So inside this overarching instrument, the Green Climate Fund, we can, for instance, sometimes it's going to be better for us to work with KfW. Later on, it will be much interesting to work with the World Bank, and so that's what I meant.
I see. Okay, very interesting, as a channel to other sources. Maybe we take 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll ask the panelists to say anything they want in response to the questions or to each other.
Hi, Lorenzo Pitcho from DevHead. So my question was for the minister. Brazil has, of course, an emerging donor program, and currently health and agriculture seem to be the priorities for that program. I was wondering if Brazil was planning to maybe, focus more on environment as a priority sector for its own aid engagement.
Okay, other questions? You're very quiet. Everybody's satisfied. No, here's one. Dan, please introduce yourself.
Dan Morrow. I'm now teaching about climate change policy at George Washington University. A question for Billy. You mentioned the donor faddishness, which of course has been a problem in development assistance for decades, and suggested that whatever system is in place for climate finance ought to be flexible in order to respond to donor fads. That's in fact the point that you made, I believe. But imagine a world in which, in fact, the developing countries do have good national strategies that are reasonably comprehensive. Why not basically let donors associate their financing with whatever components of those national strategies meet their fad without actually changing what the national strategies do? In other words, money's fungible. Why not allow the donors to suffer the illusion that they're actually changing what the donors or what the developing countries are doing?
Build on the lack of fungibility illusion. Yes, please.
Hello. Ruben Lubowski, Environmental Defense Fund. So I guess I'm thinking just more broadly, I mean, we've been talking about sort of dedicated funds for climate. I'm thinking more broadly, basically all public and private finance has some impact on the climate. Some of it is, most of it's negative maybe, and some of it could be positive. But how do we think about sort of aligning that broader finance and including public finance for international activities in terms of the finance that may have negative impacts on the climate? So how do we think about that as part of this bigger picture?
Yeah, this is the concern about mainstreaming environment and climate into everything. Okay, let's go in reverse order. Barry, do you want to make your last answer questions or
Well, I'll just
points?
say two things. First, I'm still convinced that the best way for us to get started, at least, is to develop a really good plan to spend the money in developed countries, starting with a lot of no regrets initiatives, because then if we have such a plan on how to spend the money in developed countries, then the spending might actually happen. And the last thing I want to say is I agree with the distinction that Billy made, that you have to bear in mind that in some cases you want to spend directly, like on R&D, or on maybe some very specific subsidies, but there'll never be enough money, as he said, to solve the problem that way. So we have to figure out some clever ways to spend the money indirectly on regulation, which involves devising standards and then spending the money on enforcing the standards.
Let me just touch on a few points that have come up. So, the issue that Barry's making about, domestic spending versus international spending, I mean, you could actually think about almost a continuum of, multilateral at one end, bilateral gives us a lot more control, even though it's international, and then you have, just go ahead and spend it domestically. And I guess, as we've been discussing, I would put a finger on the fact that, I think the multilateral piece is pretty important. We could have a secondary conversation, I guess, about that. And so, part of what I've tried to emphasize is how you can, try to attract as much as possible. This predictability notion that has come up a couple of times, I just wanted to throw out an idea. I understand everybody wants predictability. I want predictability. Power plants want predictability when they're investing domestically. Everybody wants predictability. I don't know that we can ever get it. And so, one thing to think about is there a way we can design something that can actually deal with the lack of donor predictability? Because it might actually be kind of useful. Then the last point I would just say is this comment about matching our kind of dealing with donor fads. I think that's exactly the idea. I mean, it's we had talked very early in the negotiations, I recall, about actually having some sort of a matching registry where donors and recipients would come together and you could just pick the things that met your fad. And I don't know whatever happened with that internationally. I feel like it may have kind of fallen by the wayside. But I think trying to build those sorts of features into the architecture would make a lot of sense. It would satisfy everybody.
Trying to talk about how to align climate finance to broader finance and development. I think what we are trying to do, one concrete example in the agriculture, we are trying to do is to actually create initial incentives for farmers to adopt low carbon technologies. And the idea is that in the future, this becomes business as usual. So the climate finance should connect to broader development policies and bring that concessionality, that level of concessionality that's necessary to do something different than business as usual. So we started this low carbon agriculture with $1 billion. Now it's $2 billion, and maybe it can become $100 billion. That's the total agriculture finance in the country. So the idea is to transform that into something that will become business as usual in the future. In terms of, I'm not sure if I got correctly your question, but it's. I would say that the climate change agenda came because of the environmental agenda. So let's say our strategies were really focused on deforestation because of biodiversity and other important aspects of these policies, and the climate change came as almost as a co-benefit to that. So it's more or less what I'm trying to say, that you need to connect to countries' strategies and priorities and see how climate finance is going to fit to that.
I'm going to summarize. Lawrence is giving me a hard time. This is what I wrote down, how to spend it if we had it. R&D, forests, country development priorities, but keep the donors happy by pretending it's filling buckets they like. Call it adaptation money and use it to support girls' education in low-income countries. And finally, develop a model more like the MCC, where Artur and Billy could agree completely on how to proceed. Thank you very much to this panel, and we move to the next one.